Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Lee Grace. So Lee Grace is saying if we've got any questions as we go, put them in the chat, um, or do feel free to just, you know, come off mute and shout and say, well, hang on, can we just talk about this? Or what about this situation? Or how do you handle that? Whatever it is. Okay, so feel free to pop it in the chat or to just interrupt because it's not, I think we're looking at sort of 12 of us live and then everybody else will be, catching up later, I suppose. So do feel free to shout. Okay, so in this session, William and I are going to look with you at the characters in the course and some of those things that they represent in terms of diversity on a range of issues. And just noticing on this slide that we've now got book 3 in the images. So I know it's not out for those of us in the UK, it's not out yet. I think in the UK we're expecting sort of December, January to have that available, but it is out in the US. Okay, so William, over to you for this.
Yeah, and if you like to follow along on your own device, as opposed to wait for us to progress the slideshow, you can use that QR code. You can scan that QR code and follow along on your own device, on your own devices, as well as using that tiny URL if you are not able to scan the screen, because technology sometimes, even when you're scanning, it won't pop up. And so it's always a good idea to have both a QR code and an URL link. And we also have put up our contact information, our emails up there. I'm also on X, formerly known as Twitter, and that is my handle if you like to get in touch with us. Now then,
Great, it's William.
yeah, and so if you look at the slide, this is a slide of characters that are from books 1 and 2. And so I kind of wanted to invite everybody at this time to kind of look at the pictures and tell me how are they different than the traditional courses with which you may be familiar. How are these characters different? Just I know we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, as always, as Semper, as always, but it is important to kind of look and see before we really delve into the storyline. And so kind of talk about that. Do we have any volunteers who like
In the
to?
chat, William Lee Grace has put way more women. We've got only one toga, not all white.
Awesome, definitely.
Age differentiation. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a very wide range of characters in Suburani, from different places of the empire, as well as someone pointed out, the different age groups. There is a parrot, our favorite bird, and a lot of non-Romans or marginalized groups are represented as well. So, yes, cannot forget about the parrot. And so if we go look at the next slide, this textbook, of course, is based on the Imperium Romanum around AD 64. And so, as you can see, this is the empire, the Imperium Romanum at this time. And so again, um, unlike a lot of the traditional courses where we spend a lot of time in Italy, and in Britannia, we actually have characters and storylines that span, from the west end of the Imperium Romanum to the east end of the Imperium Romanum. Again, we still have Britannia, but we also have storylines taking place in Africa as well. And so, again, we are trying very hard to bring in that diversity in both character, in the geography in all sorts of representations so that you get a better idea of what living in Rome, as in the Roman Empire, was truly like. And that's one of the things that, a lot of the students will notice. They look at our textbook and they go, so this is what, like, again, this is anecdotal, but they go, one of my little girls last year, she saw the textbook, and we've been using Cambridge at, for a long time. And so that's what she's familiar with. But she said, oh, so this is probably more what ancient Rome looked like than what we are dealing with in our textbook, right? And I was like, and that's without any prompting. It was all on her own. So I was very appreciative of that comment.
And if we look then at one of the images, the very first chapter, the very first page, really, we can see a little bit of that representation of the diversity of characters here. And I suppose we'd notice some of the things that you guys were saying when William put up that range of characters just a moment ago, in terms of the diversity of age and the color of the skin and gender and so on, and difference of wealth perhaps as well. And when we were creating it, we tried to work out, what actually would be that mix. So we were looking at a range of evidence for that, and we would look to a certain extent at crowd photos today from southern Mediterranean countries and North Africa as well. And Helen's saying, my online students, all freshmen must find the diversity and occasions natural next step. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Um, yeah, right. I mean, it's interesting, sort of, when you're talking, Helen, about the agency of women in this image. I mean, perhaps something we can talk about here is something that you could choose not to talk about if you wanted to with your students, um, depending on their age. But if we look over towards the right hand side, um, then we can see there's a guy here in a doorway being reproached by a lady, and there's another lady behind him. Now, we imagine this as a scene of prostitution, in fact, and that's on the very first page. Now, you don't have to, obviously, you don't have to go into that with the younger students. Um, there's all sorts of ways you could explain that scene, but it's there if you want to. So I suppose when we're talking about characters and diversity, there's also a diversity of approach that you can take to it. And we've got here another character whitewashing out a statement on the wall. Faustus says, "For." Now, they're not going to know at this point who he is, or who or what Faustus is, or anything about what that means, but you can come back to it later, of course. So just because you may not sort of investigate something in an image right away doesn't mean to say that later on, when the children are older, when they've seen a little bit more, some of these issues can't be returned to. Okay, William, over to you.
So I want y'all to kind of take a moment and see some of these characters. Probably need to fix the margins and whatnot for future presentations. But you see 8 characters that you will encounter in the course. So we have Katya, Rufina, Barca, Zebdella, Lucilius, Lucas, Phoebe, and Hermione, or, really, Hermione and Poibe, but um, I was just rewatching Harry Potter just very recently. So Hermione, that name is in my head right now. And so for our next activity, again, we're going to try to get y'all involved a little bit. We're going to show you a map of 4 different places where the storyline is taking place. So does anybody know where that upper left-hand corner location is? And we'll kind of go back and forth with the slide and the previous slide so you can kind of see the characters. So again, the upper left. So we have, okay, so Arl, Are latte? Possibly. Possibly. And so any other guesses? It's okay. As we tell the students, do not be afraid. And sometimes it is okay not to be right. So we have Ephesus. Okay, that's another good one. So again, upper left-hand corner. So to the as I'm looking at the screen, to the left of the Colosseum. And so okay. So that's in fact Duga, which is Tunisia. And so that's Africa. And then, of course, we'll have Italia as represented by the Colosseum. And does anybody know where this, right here, this picture, where, yay! So Jackie says you've been to Duga. And so, again, it's all good. It is definitely all good. So so our latte, possibly again, possibly. So that's actually Britannia. So it's actually Aqua Solis. So that is the a model of
Oh, I
Aqua Solis. Yeah, see you can kind of see the bath complex and the temple complex now. So yeah. And then of course we do have Asia. As you can see, we do have Ephesus right there. And so now we're going to flip back to those characters, and I'm going to type the names in the chat for you. And so in just a moment, we're going to have you see if you can place them in the right corners. And this works much better in person, of course, because you can actually have people get up and move, which again, sometimes you want your students to be moving about. And so we have again Katya, Rufina, Barca, Zebdella, Lucilius, and Lucas, and Phoebe and Hermione. And so I believe everyone should be able to annotate. If you click on the little right, the little pen, you can annotate and you can just go ahead and write the names of the characters in whichever slide it is. So, and yes, actually, we want you to kind of participate. So thank you, Jackie. Really appreciate you. Oh, good. We'll have Katya. Excellent. We have Lucas. Awesome. So you place them in Britannia. In Africa, we have Hermione. Okay. Excellent. And we have Lucilius in Italia. So Barca. Okay. All right. So, okay. All right. So going once, going twice. All right. So let's see. We're going to clear all the drawings and then we're going to show you the correct answer. So in Africa, we have Barca and Hermione or Hermione. In Italia, of course, we'll have Rufina and we have Lucilius. And in Britannia, we have Katya and Lucas. And Asia, that's where we get Zebdella and Phoebe. So nicely done. But again, as I mentioned earlier, um, diversity is an extremely important topic. And so again, the storylines are taking place in different parts of the empire, and again, with the different characters as well. And so as a reading course, we want the students to really get attached to the characters, as well as piquing their curiosity about the different locations, right? Like you talk about the setting of the story. And so it's extremely important for you to kind of, again, have that diversity in there. And so the course starts the first 6 chapters in the city of Rome. So we get to meet Rufina, Sabina, some of those characters. Um, and then, we have a family that moves into the city of Rome with Isco and Katya. And so we're going to then do a little flashback, um, to kind of dealing with the storyline. So again, the first 6 chapters will take place Romine. And then,
Yeah. And then, as you're saying, William, we have this flashback to Britannia. And as William said earlier, the setting in Rome is 64 AD. And the flashback here is to 61, 62 AD with Boudicca's rebellion. Um, and so you can see here that in terms of roughly where in Britannia we go, we have Londinium, which is quite interesting for the students to realize that there wasn't anything there until the Romans came along. Camalduman, which was the local capital of one of the tribes, and if there was a capital of Britannia, I guess at this point it was there. Although the extent to which one can talk about a united country, of course, it didn't exist, did it? So but it was certainly a powerful center. Aquae Sudis as well is one of the places we go to. So it's relatively restrained. Um, we're going to look in this section. We'll come back to these characters later on, or some of them at least. Katia and her parents, Lucas. This is quite an interesting um, statue, sort of Victorian statue of Boudica. Of course, Boudica representing sort of British fighting back against an imperialist power, at, and yet at a time created this statue created at a time when Britain was very much itself an imperialist power, doing to others what Boudica had been fighting the Romans, doing to them. So a lot of contradictions there, if you like, and that's one of the things we tried to do in the Britannia section is to think quite, quite a lot about, what were the identity of these different people, the different tribes, how did they each relate to the Romans, and we'll see that a bit as we go through this session.
well, there's a question in the
Yeah.
chat about the usage of AD and BC versus BCE and CE. Why um, that
Why do we
choice was
use
made?
BC? Why don't we use BC? Yeah, because we did wonder about it at the time when we discussed it. I think we felt that what do we mean by a common era? BCE and CE stand for common era. In what way are they common? Um, and we just thought really it's a fudge, isn't it? We're saying there's a common era. Well, is there? Is there? So it didn't feel any better to us than BC and AD. I suppose to use BC and AD, you can reject the idea of Christianity if you want. And it's very clearly, Christian concept, isn't it? Whereas if you say it's a common era, I think we felt it's implying that there's communality when actually there isn't. So that was our rationale for not using it. It didn't seem any better than the alternative. I know it's quite common, but it didn't feel to us any better than the alternative. And in some ways, it was worse because it was implying um, an agreement, if you like, that we felt didn't exist. So that's why we didn't use it. Okay.
And then chapters 11 and 12, before we arrive in oral, it's again going back to some of our presentations from the webinars earlier, about pacing and whatnot. If you're not able to finish all of book 1 in 1 year, there's certain places where you can certainly end the story. And I think chapter 12 is a good place to kind of, and although people tears will be shed and you really leave them wanting more. And so if you want them to come back the following school year to wanting to know what happened, or encourage them to read ahead, that's a good way to kind of stop the course, finish the year at chapter 12 and then make them go, we want to know more. Oh, you can't end there. It's so sad. What happened? And so then we start with chapters 13 to 16 taking place in Gallia, where we meet some characters like Papilius and Letta. And we find out that they've been taking care of Sabina for 3 months now. And so kind of, again, beg you to ask, and the students ask the question, what happened? And what's happened to Sabina? Why isn't she, with her family? And we talked earlier also about the diversity in the age of characters because, if you look at Letta and Papilius, you can tell they're an elderly couple, and that's another marginalized group that we really haven't talked about much in some of the other textbooks. And we meet in these chapters, we again are dealing with diversity of character, and there's another character named Gabrus, an old actor, and there's this super poignant storyline of him collapsing, out of exhaustion and basically, I mean, again, super sad storyline and trying to figure out what to do. And so again, we kind of don't really think about this, right? But I mean, who's going to take care of the elderly if they don't have their own children? How do they take care of themselves? And, to have Alexander, to have Sabina, is it a mutual relationship, right? Like, it's are Papilius and Leda really, like taking care of Sabina, but also at the same time, Sabina is taking care of them. And so that diversity of character really can open up a lot of opportunities for some really meaningful discussion.
Mm. And we can talk about those issues today, can't we, in our own society? How do we look after the elderly? How are the elderly supported? And we may have students in our classes who are carers for elderly relatives. And what happens in any society when people get old and need care? How do we structure that? What are the in practical terms, what are the costs of doing that if people move away and so on? So it allows us to sort of deal with modern issues as well, I think. Great. Um, I just flick back a little bit to this because another reason why we put, we located this in Arles is that it is a great place to take school trips to. So I know a lot of us are used to taking the students to Rome and Pompeii in Italy, but I mean, I took many years ago some school groups to Arles, and I mean, there's lots of great sites nearby. Obviously, there's Arles itself. There's Romaine, there's Pont du Gard, there's Nîmes, you can pop up to Avignon, there's Orange. So I would, it's not an accident that we chose a place which is actually very practically useful for a school visit. So I would encourage you to think about that. If you're thinking about taking students, if you're coming from the UK, you can get down there on a coach relatively reasonably. And if you're coming from the US, it's relatively straightforward, I would think, to combine that with a trip onto Rome and Pompeii. So then we also base part of the storyline in Canimbriga, which is Western Lusitania, Portugal. And part of our aim, as William was saying earlier, was we wanted to go, really north, south, east, and west, and North Britannia here west, the westernmost part of the Roman Empire in Canimbriga. And we can see, and this wasn't our plan when we started, but we can see actually book one ends with a happy scene of of a marriage, and that's we talk about characterization. Actually, the characters themselves sort of took over um, and uh, um, and took us out that way. And some of you putting in the chat as well, sort of agreeing with the idea of taking a trip uh, to Arles, and a really good point that you can combine it, particularly for those of us with smaller classes, you can combine with the French department, or as some of you are saying now, with the Spanish department, and so on. So you really do think about that in sort of practical terms to make those trips a little more viable. So we go right over to the west in Canimbriga. If you've not been there, I can recommend it. There's a lot more work to be done at the site for sure. Plenty of it is still to be uncovered. Um, okay, um,
And then
William, over
we
to you.
return to Italy with the storyline taking place in Pompeii. And so again, you can kind of see the amphitheater at the edge of the city right there, with the Palaestra right next to them, and Vesuvius still looking like the Vesuvius that people know, right? It looks nothing like the Vesuvius that we know today. So not quite at that point of AD 79. So, but it's getting
I,
there.
and you may notice in the storyline at this point that we very gently put in some things about. I mean, it's one of the stories where the waves are sort of in the harbour, sort of shaking a little bit. The water's sort of a little disturbed, and that I'm not sure too many people pick up on it. I think it probably sort of comes across as perhaps as just the wind, but that sort of thing's put in there actually to show that there were tremors going on at this point. So it's a little bit of a, I suppose, a forewarning of what's to come. When Hannah drew this map of Pompeii, based on some of the latest research, it was really surprising to us. It really, pushed it home how different Pompeii was at the time to what it is now.
Yeah, I mean, how
Okay.
close it was to the water, right? Like now when we imagine Pompeii, we don't think of it as a coastal. It's like right there by the coast, but it was.
Great. Okay. Um, and then we head over to Africa, to North Africa. Um, One of the sort of techniques we use to do this is that in the wedding that we've just seen there, Sabina and Alexander are getting married, and Alexander is a mosaic maker who they would have traveled around a little bit. So that was a sort of a mechanism for us to move them around. Um, because we tend to deal the characters in our course tend to be relatively poor. There's not that much in the way of original evidence for individual people, but Hermione at this part of the course is such a person. And as we were writing the course, there was an article in the press where lovely Dorothy Thompson from Girton College in Cambridge, where the mummy of Hermione actually is kept, was saying that not many people go to see Hermione anymore um, uh, at Girton. So we thought, well, we could just write her into the course, and then that would possibly sort of generate some more interest. So Hermione is based on, is to some extent, a real character. So you can see the mummy there. And this takes us to North Africa. The storyline reflects a little bit Dido and Aeneas at this point as well. So we're linking, you can see that image there, animals coming as well as many other things, obviously, but animals coming from North Africa over to Rome, thinking about how the empire, so if you like, ties together and sucks so much material and animals and people into the center. Okay,
Yeah, and then we move on to the eastern end of the Imperium Romanum, going um, from northern Africa to Greece, and then we take a step into Asia. It's 27 to 29 in Ephesus. And so again, as we mentioned earlier, the idea is that we want to make sure all the corners of the Imperium Romanum can make an appearance, and so that we can have some very fruitful discussion, so that it's not just all very um, Roman centric, Italian centric, kind of point of view, but an empire-wide point of
Mm.
view on the different locations and characters as well. And so speaking of characters, if you look at this picture right here, these are the characters that we get to know and love in book one. And you can see, Rufina, Sabina, and of course, front and center, it's Calier. And yes, pets are people as well. And so the kids fall in love with Calier as well as the parrot. And so, um, again, talk about diversity of characters, right? It's not just human characters, but also animal characters as well.
So I think now we're going to look at some of these characters in a little more detail. So we thought let's have a look at Sabina. Um, and I don't know if you can see that or if it's just going off the screen a little bit, but we wanted, I suppose, very concerned to start with the characters talking directly to the students because it's a character-based course. The students are going to see the Roman world through the eyes of these characters. So the people we choose are central to shaping the student's view of the Roman world. And so rather than saying, this is Sabina, we really wanted her to directly address the students. So it's not this is Sabina, we're looking from the outside, but I am Sabina. She is talking directly to us, and the aim of that is to draw us much more rapidly in. So we see her there, and then in the second image over on the right, we get her from a different angle. We see her looking out of that window. So we that immediately locates her in an insula, and we can start to think, okay, well, who is she? Does she look wealthy, poor, middle of the road? Is she surrounded by people here? She's on her own. All sorts of questions we can start to ask the character at this point. I'm not going to obviously. There's a lot of places where Sabina turns up in the course. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but just a few things that are probably worth considering. So very early on, we see that she's being brought up by her father, her dad Faustus, and her auntie Ravina. We don't mention the mum. Then obviously there must have been a mum at some point, but where is she? Is she alive? Is she dead? Did she die in childbirth? Did she die in a later childbirth? At no point is it mentioned anywhere in the course. So there's no point going looking for it. We didn't write it in. And we ourselves, the authors don't, I mean, we never came to any sort of decision. There was not necessary. The characters know what happened. So they don't feel the need to talk about it because they all know. So it's always utterly unsaid. And you'll find through the course that there are a lot of things that aren't said because the characters know it. And also if we answer that question, it shuts down discussion, it shuts down ideas, and that's the opposite of what we want to achieve. In these images, just gently note, I think, that Faustus is asking his sister where Sabina is. Now, what does that imply? To me, it suggests that it's possibly Rufina, the aunt, who is maybe a little closer to Sabina, a little more responsible for bringing her up than her dad is in some ways. So I don't want to, draw go too much into that, but I would just think, okay, what exactly are the relationships between, the uh, the three of them there?
Well, there's some
Yeah,
questions from the
yeah.
chat. And
Sorry.
so, no, that's okay. So sorry to interrupt. So Jackie
Ah,
was
okay.
wondering about why questions don't use the nay suffix. And also Elizabeth has a question about how Sabina is obvious. She can read, as we find out pretty early in the storyline. So does this ability play a significant role later in book two?
Yeah. Okay. So let's take those differently. I mean, really, Jackie, the reason why we don't use net at the start is because it's a little bit too much linguistically to throw at the students right away. And you don't always need it in sentences like this, where, we've got a question word like that makes it very clear to the reader or the listener that it's going to be a question. So at the outset, we don't put that on. We bring that in, I think, around about chapter 11, that starts to come up. Um, and this question about Sabina can read. Well, I would be, we do see her looking at, we use the term, Leggett, she's reading. She's looking at a particular scrap of the virus paper. She's looking at a particular thing. She's reading it, but what do we mean by reading that? I don't think we're talking about her, opening a scroll of Virgil and, reading it all through. It reading, as we know with our own students, don't we, takes a sort of variety of forms. And she could be unpicking it. This could, I mean, I think it could be something that she's got from a note from her mother years ago that she keeps close to her. It's meaningful to her, perhaps, and somebody has told her what it means, and so she's reading it there. So, personally, I don't go big into the fact that she's able to read. Um, what we're trying to do is use Lego, Legis, and Legit there to show different persons of the verb with a Latin verb that the students can probably guess relatively easily because of legible and illegible and from the images. So personally, I take it that she can a little bit, if you like, interpret the shapes. But that's the limit that I have of her sort of reading. Okay. I don't think that sort of comes up much later as a sort of a sort of a key ability. Okay. Um, Something to bear in mind with Sabine that we need to be aware of is that Faustus, her dad, is trying. If we skip on to the next slide, this is actually in chapter 5. We'll see here. Faustus is, he puts money on the chariot racing. He's trying to make money for himself and his little family. And we notice in this text, Gisco saying, well, I want a sort of safe life for my family. I've got a son. And Faustus says, well, I've got a daughter. I want to protect her, but it's difficult. What's the problem? Well, the senator and this is the guy who owns the block of flats, the apartment building that Faustus is sort of running. Um, well, he either wants the money back that I owe him, or he's going to take my daughter. No, they're not into slavery, but into debt bondage at this point. But uh, that's all to say. That explains this little slide here from chapter 6, where the senator's enslaved man heads over to try and pick up this money and says essentially to Sabina, you need to be careful. Your life is in some danger. If you don't, if your father does not hand over this money, it's you we're going to be taking in exchange to debt bondage. So um, that's the level that she's at in terms of sort of wealth in society. She could lose her freedom because of the poverty of her family and some of the mistakes that her dad's made in trying to make their life better. And then the Britain section is a flashback that's probably taking place 1, 2, 3 nights in a bar. The stories being told there may only be a single evening, I think. It could be a little longer. And while that's been going on, notice what happens at the very end of that section when they're sort of just wrapping up their chat. Lucrio comes in and says towards the bottom there, Omnia paravi, I've organized everything. And Faustus turns to his daughter and said, you need to go. It's too dangerous for you. You've got to get out. So away you go. And we see this is then down, they head down to Ostia. And I just wanted to show you this, the reactions of two of the characters, Lucrio, the enslaved man, and Rufina, the auntie. We can see here Lucrio crying. There's a connection there, crying as Sabina needs to leave, and Rufina, who puts on at least her fortis erat vultus Rufinae. Whatever she was feeling inside, she's putting on a tough exterior. Does she actually feel that way, or does she feel similar to Lucrio? So an opportunity there to again to look at some of the characters, how they're portrayed. Sabina gets on the boat. I mean, we won't follow all of it through, but she, in a storm, she clings to another passenger, Alexander, and that develops into a love affair. That's sort of on off a little bit, and the students wonder which way things are going to go. They get married, but later in book two, they find that they are unable to have children, and they separate. Now, the reason for that is to partly to move the storyline along a little bit, but also partly to show to the students that one of the primary aims of a Roman marriage was to generate children. And if that isn't able to happen, then the marriage may not continue. So part of that storyline is helping the students to understand the role of marriage in the ancient world. I'm not going to go. You can read on for yourselves to see what happens. When they separate, we work very hard to ensure that it is nobody's fault. We present it as the gods are not favoring the marriage, because plenty of the students will be going through situations where their parents are separating, and we really wanted to show that when that happens, it doesn't have to be this person's fault or that person's fault. It's sometimes things just don't work. Um, so we're relatively delicate, I think, with that. But you can read the rest of the book too and see what happens. Okay, William.
And as you can see, a lot of care really has been given to the development of these characters and thinking about some of the storylines. And taking students' feeling and how they could react to different situations. And one of the things that people have pointed out is that there are a lot of female characters who aren't just sitting there in the location, or there hardly any storylines. We see them in some courses, but then they don't do a whole lot. Whereas Rufina, Sabina's aunt, really is a woman of consequence. And then by that, I mean, she takes ownership. She owns the Popina, right? And so she is a business owner, and that's kind of not the typical role of a woman. And so, and she's also a Christian, right? Which is kind of rare at this point in time. And spoiler alert, she actually becomes a doctor at Ephesus. And so she went from an owner of a popina to a doctor. And I think that really says a lot about her as a person. Um, being able to run a business on her own and have this desire to better herself and learning the skills necessary in order to survive at a different place, and using a different trait. And so I think, and again, everyone's favorite bird, that's Takas, right? The parrot. And so, the diversity of the different characters. I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but it's there are a lot of nuance that you can really look into when discussing the characters.
And I think something we can say there, is that Rufina's interest in medicine is to some extent tied into her Christianity, her desire to look after others. So she, that's sort of what sort of kicks that off to some extent. And also, it tells us a lot about the status of medicine in the ancient world, isn't it? That anybody could could start to get involved in it. Um, Let's look briefly. I've got a lot of slides. I'll have time to go quickly through them. Let's look quickly at correct. I'm quite interested in him because certainly in the UK, um, the, the student group that struggles most in school, that has the sort of the lowest, if you like, sort of ongoing attainment rate, is white working class boys. So I think it's important as we bring in a range of other characters that we don't forget. white working class boys, and others as well. Let's look at his character where we meet him. He's enslaved, and we see him standing at the side of the road. I don't know how old you'd say he is there, 6, 7, maybe. We don't, we didn't really tie down ages for the characters or for a lot of them as we were creating this, but maybe 6, 7, 8 years old. Um, he stood at the side of the road, and he's enslaved by Faustus, and he is essentially there to try to get people to take rooms in the flats that that uh, um, Faustus runs. Um, we see him as often very attached to the dog, and when uh, it looks like that dog is going to leave with his owners Gisco and so on, he feels really upset that he's losing someone he loves. Um, and it leads into this story in chapter 6, which I thought would be useful just to touch on a little bit. It's to some extent it's based on the sort of the bit of Varro. Um, but if we look at this bit in the middle here, Cortilla, who's his mother and also enslaved in the same family, um, is picked up. You're very sad. Why is that? Um, and he explains there 5 to 6. And then if we look in line 7, tu multos amicos habes, you've got a lot of friends. Your mother, I love you. And Faustus, and then she pauses. Well, at least I suppose with Faustus you're secure. And um, he goes on to say, well, you work all day in the Popina, and I work all day in the streets. We're tools rather than people. And Cotillard sort of interestingly really says, look, actually, he he kind of cares for this familia more than the family, obviously, a great deal. And there's a little bit here to say there's not always the huge difference between workload of enslaved and free. We might think, Lucrio and Faustus often working side by side together, long hours. And I'm working with Sabina and Rufina long hours. So, and it reminds us that there are occasions in Rome's history where the very poor sold themselves into slavery. And this chapter is about slavery and enslavement. I want to go back to this sort of ellipsis, this pause in line 7, because when she says, I, your mother, I love you, and Faustus, you can just think, well, she's thinking there, what do I say about Faustus? Well, I suppose the best I can say is at least we're safe, or you're safe. But you could also say that she stops herself from saying, ego mater tua te amo et Faustus pater tuus. So you don't need to go in there, but into that. But there was an opportunity there to do that, to talk about how someone in Cortilla's position would, in reality, have been treated and the horrors of that in a chapter that's about enslavement. Again, that's something you might return to with older students. Some of us might never want to go there with that. Others of us may feel actually it's very important that students know some of these really, really tough unpleasant realities of slavery in the Roman world. So as we write these things, we try to give you options of what you want to do, whether you want to go into something, whether you don't. So it's try to make it your choice. Something else in that same story, just at the end, a guy turns up and he says to Rufina, do you want to sell your enslaved lady, enslaved woman? Well, for someone like Cortilla, corrects his mother, probably her primary fear would be getting separated. And that's very often what happened with enslaved families. They would get separated, sold separately to different people, and you never see your family members again. So as well as often losing your own name and your own identity, you lose connection with your own children. So again, absolutely devastatingly terrifying question for her to hear asked. Um, okay, I'll go very quickly. We also see a situation here in William talked about chapter 12. There's a fire of Rome that's collapsed. Portilla's in a building, as well as some others. That building collapses, and we suspect that she dies at that point. When we get to Pompeii, we see very gently, it's not obvious to start with in that first chapter of book two, first page of book two, but it becomes clear on the second page. We see that actually Curax is now with Gisco, and we see then in a later story, actually, and again, we probably haven't got the time to sort of dig into this, but have a look for yourselves. We see later that Cortilla has survived, and if you look there at line 25, um, she has been freed uh, she's been purchased and freed by Gisco because she saved Gisco's own child in that fire. Um, Now, she's been purchased and set free, but her son hasn't. Gisco, why is that? Well, Gisco might repay Cortilla for her, for what she's done for his son. But, he's also a realist. He's not going to buy up everybody and set them free. So he's bought up Courage, but he's keeping him. Thanks very much. Um, okay. We do see, and I don't know if you noticed this, but I thought I'd take the opportunity today to point it out that when we first see a drawing of Cortilla in book two, you may notice she's got some significant burns on her face there. Of course, we don't see the rest of her body, but we can see that those scars from that fire in chapter 12, remain with her both outside and also mentally as well. Okay. Um, just to quickly sort of zip you through here, later on, we see her saying, "Sed sempre Tristus sum nam caracem liberare maxima." I really want to free myself, but I'm poor. So she's thinking, how can I get the money together to buy my son from Gisco and free him? Okay, over to you, Whitney.
And I know in the chat someone pointed out that people have been disappointed that Sabina doesn't get together with Lucilius. And that's interesting that someone pointed it out because, again, with diversity of characters, there are all kinds of storylines, right? And so with Lucilius, um, it, it's actually tied somewhat to the LGBTQ plus storyline and characters. And perhaps students will be super shocked by this revelation. But it certainly is a good time to address how the Romans and other ancient cultures viewed this issue, as opposed to modern societal values like Sparta. You can talk about, Spartan customs and whatnot, if again with older students. But this selection in chapter 24, the Memorantes UN Tutem storyline with Pilo, who is Lucilius's old friend. And so they are kind of reunited at the Areopagus and they kind of recall their friendship back in their youth. And so you can see Philo is now married, you know, and but he also says, Amator quaque optimus mihi est. And so not only is he married, but he has an amator optimus. And so again, that it's there, it's subtle, but certainly you can use this opportunity to kind of talk about it. And then also Lucilius's reaction, right? Like he says, how lucky Philo is to be in video omnia bona meres, you deserve all the good things, right? And then he laments about se mihi talus vita non erit. There will not be such a life for me. And that's very poignant because he, kind of talks about his perspective and how that ties into his social status as an upper class Roman, someone who is expected to go through the political ranks, and how many of our students continue to deal with that idea of, I'm not necessarily following the pattern that's expected of me. you know, and you know, should I hide this or should I be brave and talk about it and come out to people? And so again, depending on your audience, you're the ones who can kind of gauge your audience and your students and decide what to talk about and what not to talk about. And so again, great opportunities for you.
Thanks, William. Let's look a little bit at another one of the characters, Gisco here. So we see him together with Katia coming in to Rome, and it's interesting because at the start, you know, when William was asking, what do we see in these different characters? One of the things that was coming up there is, well, there's non-Romans included. Well, you know, he's Roman, but he's never been to Rome until this point, and he's fought for the Roman armies. He's never been to Rome. So, what do we mean when we say that someone is Roman or was Roman? What did that mean? When he gets together with Katia, Katia is a Briton coming into Rome, and as they come in, she sees the statue of Claudius over the aqueduct as they're approaching. What's her reaction to that going to be? You know, the students don't know this at this point. We're only in chapter 2, but they'll find out that her whole family has been killed in London, in Britannia. Um, And so, how is she going to react to seeing the statue of the emperor who launched the invasion? Well, you can see there from her face, and you can sort of see the text. It tells us a little bit, but then you know, as we go on, and you'll see that section in chapter 7 to 10 in the flashback to Britannia. Um, it's not the Romans that killed her family. It's another British tribe. It was Boudica and her forces that slaughtered the inhabitants of Londinium. Some were Roman, but many were other Britons. So we're trying to show the students in this storyline that, you know, the question of Roman identity or British identity, it was not at all simple. This was not the Romans against um, other cultures necessarily. Sometimes these cultures were fighting themselves, and sometimes these cultures weren't one entity that we might, you know, might naturally think that they were. Um, so part of this is dealing with identity there. When we look at Disco here, we see that he meets an old friend in chapter 7. He meets an old friend in the Forum Boarium, and we see that they were soldiers together in Britain. And so, you know, when we think of soldiers, there we are. We've got them dressed up as legionaries there. Um, but actually, and none, this is something else that's addressed in chapter 7 to 10. A large part of the work of these soldiers after Boudicca's rebellion was to win hearts and minds. So a lot of the thinking now is that Aquae Sulis was built in order to show the Britons having the Romans here can be a good thing because the Romans do not want to station vast numbers of troops in the provinces. It's incredibly expensive. They don't want to invade and then lose money from doing so. Um, so we're looking at the hard force of the Roman Empire to some extent through Gisco with the military fighting on the battlefield. But we are looking at also soft power, soft force. And we can think about that today. You know, how do our countries extend their power around the world? To some extent, hard force, and to some extent, soft power. Um, so think about that, I'd say, as we're looking at these characters and you're reading chapter 7 to 10 particularly, we find out that Gisco's heritage is Numidian. So his family's from North Africa. So again, you know, Roman or not Roman, I suppose. We see him becoming a client, taking a patron, when he's in Pompeii, but it doesn't work out. And the patron, Gisco moves into the wine business. He's growing some wine. His patron buys it off him and sells it as something that it isn't, sells it as Falernian. Um, and Gisco, he's a person of character. He said, "This isn't okay. You're lying about this stuff." Um, but this is not a happy ending. Ampliatus says at the end there to his friends, um, "Thank you," he says, "my friends." Um, and, he says, "You need to be careful, Gisco. I've got a lot of friends, both here in this dining room tonight, but also in the city." And trying to really show students sometimes the good guys don't win. Real life is not as simple as a Hollywood movie, I guess. So, that said, we're going to wind forward a little bit. Gisco gets involved in a plot to get rid of Nero. Um, I won't run all the way through with that, but I think William, you might pick up on a little bit of that later. But just to say um, that we managed to weave the characters at the very end of the course into a bit of original Suetonius. And book two finishes in chapter 68 with the death of Nero. Okay.
Let me unmute myself first. That'll help. Yeah, and so, we then, that's with Gisco again with chapter 12, there's a very poignant storyline with he and his wife, and the baby infants at the time who, again, during the disaster of 8064. So, but with Katya, it's interesting because she's the daughter of a swordsmith, and so we get to explore and kind of juxtapose the different characters and the conquered versus the conqueror, but also just among the British people who are now under Roman control, Roman ruling, um, that hey, what's one attitude, what's one perspective of the conquered versus how other people view the Romans at that time. And so really, Katia and her family kind of accepted what was happening. And in fact, the swordsmith is, making weapons for the Romans. But then, you have those obviously who don't like the Romans, like the next character that we'll talk about.
Right. I mean, very briefly, because I know we've gone six and some of us we need to head off. But just to say, as William's saying there, through Lucas, we look at the other way that one might react to an invasion of our country. And we can say to the students, what would you do? If your country was invaded, do you think here's a business opportunity? Or do you think, you know, up with this I will not put? So Lucas tries to steal a sword to fight back. We might think this is completely unreasonable, but we see fairly soon after that happens, well, he's lost his brother to the Roman invasion, and they've killed a number of his family and friends and so on. So, what would you do in that situation? And then we see a little bit of the Boudicca's attack on Camaldun and Colchester, and it's horrific with the Romans high take up defensive position in the temple there and are burnt to death. Is that okay? Is it all right to fight back against that way an oppressor? And are there circumstances where doing that to people is defensible at all? Well, there's no right or wrong answer to these questions, but the point is to show the students it's not straightforward, is it, how we react, and to look at situations around the world today where people feel they're attacked. How do they defend themselves? Is that reasonable? Isn't it? How do we have those sort of decisions? How do you have those conversations? So, okay, I'll skip over this, but it's just to say really that towards the end of the course, I mean, we haven't talked a great deal about the fact that we're in Greece for a little while, but we head further east to Ephesus, as we said earlier. Part of what we're doing there is saying, actually, some of the large part of the Roman Empire was Greek speaking, and there were sort of Greek customs going on. So, the storyline here in Ephesus and Phoebe Menandez Ramos allows us to investigate that to some extent. Um, and Zabdella here really is a way for us to show the students that the Roman Empire extended out into the deserts as well. So the a vast range of cultures, a vast range of geography and experiences and so on. Okay, we're well out of
Yeah,
time.
but
William, do you want to
also,
pick up on?
yeah, so I'm going to pick up on this really quickly as well. I know we're running out of time, but in addition to just human and animal characters, certainly inanimate objects can be characters. And one of the central, I think, central characters is a Gladius, right? The theme of Gladius. And one of my favorite movies of all time, The Red Violin. If you have not seen it, I strongly recommend it. But it's kind of that idea of a an object being a character throughout time, and so an object being a character throughout the storyline and connecting things together. It's also a very interesting thought. Um, and we also have the always, right? The columbi. We have the white columbi throughout the different chapters. So take a look. Certainly, all these could be characters. I also have put in the chat some links to some Google documents with bingo, character bingos that I had intended to play, but obviously we're running out of time. So we're not going to do that. But if you're interested, you can click on the link. It will make a copy of the bingo card in your own Google Drive. And so I put in, I think, 5 of them because I think, Will said there were about 30 people. And so I was trying to pick a number divisible by that we can have some variety and have winners as well. But again, if you can also reach out to me. I can send those to you as well. And we definitely would like to hear from you and ask for suggestions for future webinars. We have a few more coming up. So the one on the left is our feedback, and so let us know how we did with today's webinar. And also on the right is a personal presenter feedback. Just let me know how I did as a presenter, how Will did as a presenter, and that way we can continue to grow. And if you go to the next slide, if you are interested in our future webinars, you can use that QR code to go ahead and sign up for future webinars. I know the wording is cut off, but you can also use the tiny URL as well. And our next webinar will be Monday, November 4th, 5 p.m. Central, 6 Eastern, and it will be on pedagogical practices, and using tech tools. And so we're so thankful for the privilege of your time tonight. I know we went way over, but we're so happy that you stuck it out and stayed with us for this presentation. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you all in a lot of our future webinars.
Thanks, guys.